Well, hello there. And here we are at our final lecture for the course. I don't know about you, but I feel like this quarter has gone by so fast, and I've really enjoyed our time together. So, in part, I'm a little bit sad this will be our last lecture, but I'm very excited to talk about these interesting texts and more so to read your thoughts on them. So, let's dive in. The first text and the main text we'll be looking at here is the Metamorphoses by Ovid from ancient Rome. So we're going to get a second look into ancient Roman society after having studied the Aeneid by Virgil in our previous lecture. And as we'll see throughout the course of this lecture, the Metamorphoses is in many ways the opposite of the Aeneid. They have some similarities, but for the most part, it does many things very differently than the Aeneid. And one of those is that rather than telling one single story, it's a collection of short stories. It's still an epic poem for some of the ways that it's written and its structure and style and so forth, and we'll talk about that. But unlike all of the other epics we've read so far, unlike Gilgamesh and the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, it is a collection of short narratives. Almost like if we compare those other texts to novels, this is almost like a collection of short stories. And so that's very unique, very different, really interesting. I hope it makes for fun reading to have something similar and different at the same time, and to maybe it'll go more smoothly or more quickly to have these kind of little vignettes, these little short narratives or episodes rather than one long sprawling thing. Hopefully that'll be engaging for you. And here we have a picture from one of the stories from book one where Apollo is pursuing Daphne and she prays to her father, the river god, to turn her to save her, and his solution is to turn her into a tree. And I think this picture so sums up the kind of one of the central themes of this poem, which is that desire or that pursuit of the beloved subject who is unattainable. And so let's take a look and see what Ovid was trying to do with this kind of wacky, kind of different narrative poem, this different epic. Here's the recall questions. So remember, these questions are to stimulate your thinking, to kind of put you in the mode for this lecture by building on what we did in the last lecture. So in other words, these texts I'm teaching I haven't chosen them at random, but rather in a logical sequential order. And so we need to see where we're coming from as we go into this text. And so the first one for you to pause and think about is, what do you recall from the previous lesson about Roman society? What were the beliefs and values of the ancient Romans? So just like our previous 4 lectures gave us a glimpse into ancient Greek society, this last lecture on the Aeneid and on Catullus gave us a look into ancient Roman society, and we're getting a further look here. And I'm really glad we're spending 2 lessons on the ancient Romans, because you want a full picture of the society you're studying. And so rather than just looking at one text, we're looking at 2, and they're very different. So we'll get a fuller picture of Roman society by following up our study of the Aeneid with our study of the Metamorphoses. And we're very blessed to be able to have multiple texts from ancient Rome. For instance, Gilgamesh, we don't have the opportunity to study other texts from ancient Mesopotamia. It's the only one that survived, but we have many surviving texts from ancient Rome. And so this way we can get a look at at least 2 of them written in a narrative style to give us a fuller picture of that society. And so a similar question to think about is, what do you recall from the previous lesson about the Aeneid? And what are some of the central themes of this narrative poem that was the national epic of the Roman Empire? So remember, in many ways, as the textbook points out, the Metamorphoses, is the antithesis to the Aeneid, the opposite of the Aeneid. And the Aeneid was the poem, the emperor at the time, Augustus, chose to commission and made it like the national epic of ancient Rome. So we see the differences here. That's one way into studying the Metamorphoses. And then we also see the other one was the one uplifted and flown like a flag by the emperor of Rome. So we can think about why would he choose the other text but not this text, again, as a way into thinking about the Metamorphoses. So those questions are helpful. Let's take a look at a little bit of background on the life and times of Ovid the author. He was born into an aristocratic family in a provincial Roman town of Sulmo near Rome. So, very close access to Rome, the center of the empire, but not directly there. And an aristocratic family like Virgil, but unlike Virgil, he was close enough to Rome that he didn't have he had a provincial upbringing, but not a rural upbringing. Whereas, as Virgil was very much in the countryside as a child. His father wanted him to become a lawyer, and therefore had him trained in rhetoric. If you think back to when we studied the ancient Greeks, rhetoric is like, you can think of those speeches from the Iliad and the Odyssey, where Odysseus shows how clever he is through his words. That concept of rhetoric became a whole style of literature in ancient Greek. And remember, the Romans borrowed heavily from the ancient Greeks when they built their society. And so being clever and witty and persuasive in speech, the art of, as they call it, rhetoric, is one of the many things the Romans borrowed from the Greeks. And to be a lawyer, of course, you'd have to be very schooled in rhetoric. And Ovid's writing correspondingly shows the influence of this rhetorical technique because it's very polished, it's very witty, it's very clever. He has a lot of subtle things he does with language to get his points across. That's the rhetoric coming through. But Ovid had no real interest in the law, and he was very clearly naturally gifted as a poet. So much to his father's chagrin, he quit legal training at age 20. This is such a classic story. This is the kind of thing that we're looking at 2,000 years ago, but it's still true today. I remember seeing an interview with one of my favorite authors, and he said, it wasn't until my fifth New York Times bestseller came out that my dad stopped saying to me at least once a year, they're interviewing over at the post office. So there's always been this idea of a career in writing doesn't provide stability or a career. And it doesn't. I mean, it's a 1 in a million shot you make it as a writer. Not to be discouraging, but it's just interesting to see that, even a writer as impressive as Ovid with his polished, witty style, whose texts people have been studying for 2,000 years, still had this same issue, this same struggle early on. So really, really fascinating stuff. After quitting the law, he held a few minor positions in the government, but eventually had a rich patron who supported him, so he was able to become a full-time poet. A luxury many of us don't have, as I just pointed out with my last comment. And being in Rome then at this point, as an adult, he became part of the literary circles of Rome. So he knew Propertius, Horace, and Virgil, the author of the Aeneid. Virgil was about 27 years older than Ovid, so Ovid came a little bit later on, but you had what you call a literary circle. And this is really the first time we see this in literary history, which is really fascinating. Like I said, with something like Gilgamesh, that was the only text we have from that time period. We have the Iliad and the Odyssey, but no one was really doing what Homer was doing at the same time as him, at least of which we have the record. In ancient Athens with the drama, we do see some of this where they had these festivals and lots of people writing plays. So there was a thriving literary circle. But it's a very modern thing, a modern idea, concept, to have writers with a similar style, similar themes, writing at the same time and collaborating. And so this instance of this in Rome with Virgil and Ovid and their contemporaries was really unique. And with the exception of maybe ancient Athenian drama, one of the first of its kind. A little more on Ovid. He was married 3 times and divorced twice before age 30. And I think it was his 3rd wife, had a daughter from a previous marriage who he helped raise, but he had no children of his own. This might seem kind of startling to you because we tend to think of divorce as a modern thing. And in many ways it is, because a lot of parts of the Western part of the world did not allow divorce. I mean, it was frowned upon in the U.S. and England as recent as the end of the 1800s. But ancient Rome and ancient Greece had much more in common with our society today than other societies of the recent past, and divorce was, a fairly common thing then. Although this many times that young, probably uncommon then as it would be now. Ovid declared that his poetic persona should not be taken as autobiography, which is interesting. Because I talked before about how you when you read short lyric poetry, you need to separate, the poet from the speaker. You can't take for granted that they're necessarily the same person. And this is longer narrative poetry, so you don't have that concept of a dramatic situation with a speaker and a listener. But nonetheless, this is important because the Metamorphoses is filled with, erotic scenes. And as we can see, Ovid was married multiple times. So it would be very easy to make the assertion that, his poetry reflected his personal life. But he claimed it did not. And so I think that's a good lesson for studying literature is we shouldn't read too much into any text, as autobiography. And finally, the last point to make here is he had a very provocative stance toward Emperor Augustus. This is something we'll learn more about as the lecture goes on, but if you recall from the last lecture, Augustus, the emperor at the time, commissioned the composition of the Aeneid by Virgil and wanted it to reflect the values of the empire. So the Aeneid is filled with this allegiance to duty. It has family values at its center. I mean, it's all about, the protagonist Aeneas loses his family, he loses his wife, but he tries so hard to keep his son and his father with him. The decision to leave Dido is a heartbreaking one. He has to do because of duty, and then he becomes married again and builds a new family, builds a new nation. So like family values and morality and duty were the emphases of the Aeneid, and this was kind of the way Augustus wanted to frame his new empire. Remember, he was a new emperor. He'd taken over after a decade of civil war after the murder of Caesar. He wanted to be a singular ruler. He wanted to be a dictator, but he wanted to present it to the people as a democracy, even though that wasn't really the case. And so part of his strategy was to emphasize duty, to emphasize morality, to emphasize family values. And the Aeneid emphasizes those values. But as we can see here, this is a very erotic poem. It flies in the face of those values. And so that's one of the many ways it's kind of the anti-Aeneid, and one of the many ways it challenged the emperor and kind of took the emperor on. And of course, Augustus did not like that, and he only put up with Ovid for so long before he exiled him permanently. It was about 9 years before the end of Augustus's life. And Augustus lived through the turn of the millennium from BC to AD. He passed away in 17 AD and he was exiled in 8 AD. So, that's pretty significant. We'll talk more about his relationship to the emperor and more so how his text kind of challenged the values of the day as we go along in our study. So a little bit of background on Ovid. Now let's turn toward the reading questions. So the recall questions, or to more kind of jog your memory from last time, these are questions that can inform your reading as you go. And so like I've said, in many ways, Ovid's Metamorphoses is the anti-Aeneid. What are some significant differences between these two texts? Do they have anything in common? So I've already mentioned how it's, a collection of short narratives rather than one long narrative, how it flies in the face of a lot of the moral values the Aeneid emphasizes. But do they have anything in common? And this was something to kind of frame your reading so that you could jot down the similarities and differences as you read. And I wanted you to have this background going into it. That's why this was a reading question. And then while the Roman Emperor Augustus commissioned and greatly approved of the Aeneid, he greatly disapproved of the Metamorphoses, as we saw, to the point of exiling Ovid. Why do you think he disapproved of this text? We've already talked about the eroticism and how it, challenged the values he was emphasizing as emperor, but I think there are more ways as well. And so, again, a question to kind of frame your reading, some background that gives insight, but also allows for interpretation. So, hopefully, you jotted down some notes about both of these questions as you read. That will be useful now as we plunge into the text. And so, with our probing of the text here, I have a few comments to make before we get started. One is, I think, with all of these epic narratives, Gilgamesh, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, I've done some kind of plot overview. And that was a lengthy, formative part of the lecture. Not the case with the Metamorphoses, because I could do an overview of one story, but they're very short, and there's a lot of stories. So really the way to think of this is, what happens in each story is a question to ask yourself as you read and as we go through the lecture here, and then what are perhaps the connections between the stories? Because this is an episodic text. It's a collection of short narratives or vignettes or episodes, but at the same time, Ovid infused it with unity. He wanted it to be cohesive, even if episodic. And so there's a progression. There's central themes or ideas that tie the stories together. So rather than thinking about the narrative unity and how a protagonist like Odysseus or Aeneas achieves their goals, rather think about what do the stories have in common, what is binding these seemingly very different episodes together, what kind of progression do we see? And so what we're going to do this lecture, without the need for kind of a plot, series of slides on plot summary, we're going to do more close reading. We're going to look at more passages than usual. The first question I have has to do with the theme of change. As I mentioned, you should be thinking about what do the stories have in common, what binds them together or connects them, what gives the seemingly disjointed set of stories unity and cohesion. One consistent theme is change, which is kind of obvious from the title, right? The Metamorphoses. And I ask, in what ways do you see this theme in the creation narrative from book one? I think it makes sense to start at the beginning with the most fundamental theme, but change might not be something we think of or associate with creation, because most of us are probably coming from a perspective where we've grown up in a Judeo-Christian Western society. And you probably think of the idea from the Bible, going back to when we studied the Hebrew Bible, that God created the world out of nothingness. So you wouldn't necessarily associate change with creation. Perhaps, maybe you do. I'm just speaking generally here, not meaning to make any assumptions. But so where do you see this most fundamental theme in the first book, first story of the Metamorphoses, at a place you might not expect to see it? So I'm going to read kind of the last passage from that creation narrative section, and we'll see how change shows up there. And even though all other animals lean forward and look down toward the ground, he gave to man a face that is uplifted, and ordered him to stand erect and look directly up into the vaulted heavens, and turn his countenance to meet the stars. The earth that was so lately rude and formless was changed by taking on the shapes of men. So what's really interesting here is that a lot of the things that the God or the creating being uses here to make the world, the heavens and the earth, etc., were things that were already there. They were formless, but they were already there, and he changes them. He metamorphs them, into the earth and the other parts of the universe. And so rather than a God creating the universe out of nothing, this God in this version creates the universe out of pre-existing things by changing them. And so that makes this idea of change or metamorphosis, the title, central to this text from the very beginning. And so this is a very different perspective than we get from the Hebrew Bible. And so it's something I think is interesting to think about and ponder and consider, and to see how it plays out through the rest of the text. A really interesting question that comes to mind here, which is actually a question you'll have when we get to the learning questions you can choose from for the discussion board is, what similarities and differences do you see between this creation narrative and the one from the Bible or those other creation narratives that appeared early on in our textbook? And so one key difference is creation through change rather than out of nothingness, which we just talked about. But in addition to these differences, there are some similarities. For instance, there's this distinction between the humans and the animals, right? In the creation narrative of the Bible, God creates humans and animals, and they have some things in common, but humans are made in God's image and likeness, whereas animals are not. Here you have something kind of similar. While where the first 4 lines, where the animals look down toward the ground, whereas the man stands upright and looks upward toward the heavens, the stars. That's a similarity. So as different as it is from the Hebrew Bible and its creation narrative, there are some similarities. And I would love to see you suss out more of those on the discussion board. But the main idea to take away from this slide is that the idea of change or metamorphosis is crucial from the very beginning of the text on forward, and is one of the ways it has unity. Even though it has these different short stories, we see change as a central theme from the beginning, and we see a forward progression. It begins with creation. We move forward in time. From there, with change as the constant. So we've got some things here kind of grounding us in the unity of the text. Let's move forward and look at, what are some of the other central themes? What else, in addition to change, appears quite frequently? Well, in addition to change, another theme that appears over and over again is desire, and more specifically, unrequited desire. And so in this way, the poem has some things in common with Sappho and Catullus. But you have repeated stories of a lover falling in love with a beloved and never being able to attain that beloved. So it's very similar to Catullus here, even though he was writing shorter non-narrative poetry that doesn't tell a story. But it's the same idea of pursuing the beloved and never obtaining or possessing, for lack of a better term, the beloved. So that unrequited desire is a constant theme here. And let's take a look at one section that details this. This is from the Apollo and Daphne section. And it starts by talking about Cupid, which you remember the idea that Cupid, we see Cupid's a central figure in Roman mythology. So we saw Cupid struck Dido in the Aeneid, and I think we can infer that Catullus' affliction in his Lesbia poems was probably brought on by Cupid. And so here we see Cupid again. But Cupid, from his quiver, drew 2 arrows out, which operated at cross purposes. For one engendered flight, the other love. The latter has a polished tip of gold. The former has a tip of dull, blunt lead. With this one, Cupid struck Peneus' daughter, that'd be the river god Peneus, while the other pierced Apollo to his marrow. One is in love now, and the other one won't hear of it. For Daphne calls it joy to roam within the forest's deep seclusion, where she, in emulation of the chaste goddess Phoebe, devotes herself to hunting. One ribbon only bound her staying tresses. So there's kind of this debate between Apollo, or Phoebus as he's known in Rome, and Apollo saying the bow is one of my weapons, you shouldn't use it. And Cupid's like, ha, your pride is going to get you, and he strikes Apollo. But here's where it relates to my question. He also strikes Daphne, but with 2 different arrows. And this is the key passage. 2 arrows which operated at cross purposes, for one engendered flight, the other love. If you look at just those 2 words, flight and love, together, you have this theme of unrequited desire, or the unattainable beloved. She'll never be reached because she'll always be fleeing, and he'll always have this love, so it'll never be requited. It will always be unrequited. And this is part of the tragedy the poem depicts. And so we see this unrequited desire as another theme to ground us. Change is one theme, unrequited desire is a second theme. But why? Why unrequited desire? I'd love for you to pause the lecture here and jot down some possibilities. Because when I said we were going to look at 4 passages, so when we get to the 4th passage, we'll come back to this question, because I think my final question, before we get to the learning questions for discussion board, answers this or pairs with this question. So just keep it in the back of your mind. We've seen change and unrequited desire. And I use the word desire because I don't think love is appropriate. I think love is different than lust, and I think this is lust or desire here. I don't want to say unrequited. Lust sounds a little tacky. Unrequited desire. So we see change and unrequited desire as 2 central themes that unify the text. And we wonder why choose unrequited desire. We'll come back to that. First, I want to take a detour because I wonder if you were at all disturbed when reading the story of Apollo and Daphne, of how he's just running after her, and it describes them as like predator and prey. If you were at all disturbed by that, I was. So I want to, in case you all were as well, I want to address that before we revisit this question of why unrequited desire. And so if we move ahead to the 3rd story in our anthology of Jove and Io, where we see, Apollo never actually conquers Daphne, right? He is, she is turned into a tree by her father, the river god, before he can get to her. Not the case in Jove and Io. We still have unrequited desire in Jove and Io, which we'll talk about, but he does, he rapes her, to be blunt. And so that's my 3rd question. This poem in general, because it appears multiple times, not just the Jove and Io story, though we're going to look at that story in particular. This poem deals with the difficult topic of rape. Difficult, sensitive topic, but I think we can't avoid it with this text. It's too prevalent. I think if I avoided it, that would be more problematic than discussing it. So how would you, in your own words, characterize the way the poem presents rape? How does it describe it? And do you see any problems or issues with this particular form of presentation? So there's a couple ways to look at it, and so we're going to look at a couple quotes here to think about this important question. So on the one hand, when these male characters are being very lustful, most of them are gods, and pursuing women, and basically it's a repeated pattern of male gods lusting after and then abusing human women. What is the text's attitude toward those situations? And sometimes I think it's rightfully critical, and I think it mocks them. And a really good scene you have from this is at the start of book 2, when the king of the gods, whose name is Jupiter or Jove is like a nickname for Jupiter, and he's the king of the gods, the god of lightning, the Roman version of Zeus, to kind of situate this contextually. So in both Jove and Io, and then the next story, the first story we have here of book 2, he pursues and rapes a human woman. And in the one from book 2, he has to turn into a bull to be able to do it. And there are other stories from mythology like this. There's another story where he turns into a swan to rape a woman. So it says, when he turns into a bull, it says, majestic power and erotic love do not get on together very well, nor do they linger long in the same place. And then it describes him turning into a bull. And so it's making fun of Zeus here. It's saying he has to turn into a bull to fulfill this lustful, abusive, violent, and wrong desire. And so he gives up his majestic power. He's the king of the gods, but he kind of gives that up. He's not powerless, but he goes from being the king of the gods to being a bull, at least momentarily. And so it's really making fun of Zeus here. He's saying he's so, depraved. He has to turn into an animal to do this. And so I see a passage like this as very critical of rape. Even though the poem's presenting rape, it's critiquing it, which is a good thing, right? But it's not that simple. On the other hand, I think the Jove and Io story is very disturbing and concerning. And so I'm going to show you a couple passages from the Jove and Io story to represent that perspective. And so remember, Jove is Zeus or Jupiter, same character we just read about. And there's two passages here. One says, "For Jupiter had seen the girl returning from her father's banks and had accosted her." Keep that word accosted in mind. "But run she did through Lerna and Lyciria until the god concealed the land entirely beneath a dense dark mist and seized her and dishonored her." So the key words here are accosted, seized, and dishonored. To clarify, Lerna and Lyciria, if you didn't read the footnote, are one's a mountain range and one's a marsh. So she is running from him. She's trying to get away from him, just like Daphne was trying to get away from Apollo. And I said, if you're at all disturbed by the Apollo and Daphne story, don't worry, we're going to talk about that issue on the next slide. Well, here we are. Which I think even though he doesn't catch her, it's similarly disturbing. He then takes the tree and keeps it as a prize, and he would have raped her if her father hadn't intervened and turned her into a tree. And here you have actual rape, and you do in the next story as well. So it's quite disturbing, and we have to deal with that. So but run she did. So that's key, as well are the terms accosted, seized, and dishonored her. So with through Lerna and Lyciria, that means she's running across the land. So he had to use his godly power here, his power he has as king of the gods, to like cover the land in a dark mist so she can't hide from him. And then he's able to seize and dishonor her. So the reason why I think the words accosted, seized, and dishonored are bad or problematic is they're very vague. You might not even necessarily realize this is rape without the context. I mean, they all have negative connotations. Accosted is a negative word, but accosted could be all kinds of things. It could be someone yelling at someone in a supermarket. Seizing, that sounds pretty bad. And if you know it's rape, you understand what's happening. And dishonored is bad. Then again, through context, you can infer that it's rape, but it doesn't always mean that. And so they're vague words that only through the specific context do we have to infer that it's rape. And so the author here, or the narrator, seems like a very kind of passive observer. He's not, for instance, interceding and saying these things are bad, that rape is bad, that it's horrible, as he does in the next text when he kind of makes fun of Zeus for turning into a bull. And so this is hugely problematic. I've taught this poem a number of times in different classes, and I once had a student write a paper on it. And it's a great paper. It's still one of the best papers I've ever received in my 10 years of teaching. And she compared this poem to a modern poem from the 20th century called Leda and the Swan by the Irish poet William Butler Yeats. And Leda and the Swan is a retelling of another Greek/Roman myth where Zeus or Jupiter turns into a swan instead of a bull to rape a woman. But it describes the rape very vividly with the feathers and the beak and all of that of the bird, which is really disturbing, but it's very specific. And as hard of a poem as it is to read, it shows you how horrible and brutal and awful rape is and how it's something that should never, ever happen. And even if Ovid is using negative language here, I mean, the terms accosted, seized, and dishonored are negative terms. So I'm not saying he's condoning rape. I'm not saying he's saying it's all right. But he's not showing how truly horrific it is, even though he decided to include it in his poem. And so I don't know why he included so many scenes of rape. Maybe it was a cultural thing at the time. I don't know. But I think the question is, if he made the decision to include it, so we can wonder about that. But more so, I wonder, since he did choose to include it, why didn't he show the depth of the horror of it? Why is he only giving us this very surface level? It's bad. Well, it's a lot more than bad. It's probably the worst thing that can ever happen to someone. And he kind of glosses over that, dismisses it. And so on the one hand, I certainly don't think he's supporting rape or condoning it, and he does have instances where he mocks the people doing it and calls them foolish. but he doesn't show us the depth of the horror of this horrifying thing he's included. And so this is a question we'll come back to for the discussion board that if you want to, you can choose to ride on. I felt the need to address it. It's a central part of this text. Again, I don't know why it's central, but it's a part of it, so we had to address it. Now that we've addressed that, I want to come back to our question of why is unrequited desire a theme of the text? And I want to answer that question by posing another one. Classic teacher move. So here's the other question that'll help us answer that. One of the main differences between this text and the Aeneid, as we've talked about, there are many differences, is that the Aeneid presents history as teleological, or moving in a linear way toward an end goal. It's about the founding of Rome, and it moves straight forward until we see at the end of the text that Aeneas has achieved his goals and he will found Rome. Whereas on the other hand, the Metamorphoses presents history as dialectical, meaning cyclical and repetitive. The same things will just happen over and over again, and history is a cycle where it repeats and we're not necessarily moving toward a goal. And so how do you see, where are some examples of dialectical history in the Metamorphoses? And so we'll take a look at a couple examples, and then I'll connect us to the previous question. But I really think this question is fundamental to understanding the Metamorphoses, fundamental to understanding how it's different from the Aeneid, how Ovid wanted to counter what Virgil was doing and kind of counter or challenge or critique the goals of Augustus and the goals of the empire. And this, answering this question, lets us see the unity or kind of the central theme, central connection of the text as a whole. So let's take a look at two examples of dialectical history from the Metamorphoses. And the first one is from Apollo and Daphne, and it's where Daphne's father turns her into a tree. Her prayer was scarcely finished when she feels a torpor take possession of her limbs. Her supple trunk is girdled with a thin layer of fine bark over her smooth skin. Her hair turns into foliage. Her arms grow into branches. Sluggish roots adhere to feet that were so recently swift. Her head becomes the summit of a tree. All that remains of her is a warm glow. So we're back where we started with creation narrative. We're at change, metamorphosis. She's changed into a tree to save her. So if I were to pick the three most central themes that tie this narrative together, I would say change or metamorphosis, unrequited desire, and dialectical history. Why? Well, let's look at the next quote and see. So this one is from the very next story from Jove and Io. Having intuited his wife's approach, Jove had already metamorphosed Io into a gleaming heifer cow, a beauty still, even as a cow. Despite herself, Juno, that's Jove or Jupiter's wife, gave this illusion her approval, and feigning ignorance, asked him whose herd this heifer had come out of and where from. Jove, lying to forestall, to buy time all inquiries as to her origin and pedigree, replied that she was born out of the earth. Then Juno asked him for her as a gift. So this is after he's already raped Io, and his wife is going to catch him cheating on her. So he turns Juno into a cow, thinking that, and that's why he stalls, thinking he can kind of get Juno, his wife, to go away, the queen of the gods, and then he can, transform her back. But Juno is way more clever than him, which is, I think, one of the best, most interesting parts of this story. And she says, "Oh, that's a nice cow. Why don't you give me that cow as a present?" And so he's thwarted then by his clever wife. And even though he's already abused the woman, once again, it's unrequited desire. He's not even able to keep the cow, like Apollo kept the tree in the previous story. And so what I'm getting at here, there's three themes, right? That more than that, but three that are the most central: change, unrequited desire, and repetitive history. And these tell us the main meaning or message that Ovid is trying to convey through the Metamorphoses. So change, And then in both these stories, you see a literal metamorphosis, someone changing from one thing to another, just like you saw change in the creation narrative. And then after the change, you see part of it is unrequited desire. The change means the lover does not possess the beloved. And then dialectical or repetitive history, it's the same story, isn't it? There's some subtle differences, right? In one, he keeps the object as a prize after she's transformed. In the other story, he's outsmarted by his wife, but it's essentially a lustful God pursuing a woman he never fully possesses. And so it's repetitive, right? And we see it again in the next story. And it just repeats throughout the metamorphoses. So it's repetitive history. And so why unrequited desire? Well, the answer is if it's unrequited, it continues on into perpetuity. If it's requited, if the lover or the beloved, corresponds or responds, and reciprocates that affection, then you've worked toward a goal, right? Like Aeneas founding Rome. But if it's unrequited, it goes on forever, and it's the same cycle of violence. And so I think what Ovid is doing here is he's using repetitive history to show that Rome is not the end all be all. I disagree with a lot of what Ovid does in this text. Certainly the presentation of rape is problematic, and I think there are some good things, some good values in the Aeneid that Ovid's critiques of those values I don't agree with. And for the most part, I see history as teleological rather than repetitive. I think history certainly repeats, but it will eventually go somewhere. But what I agree with about Ovid that I see in this theme is a critique of Rome. I don't think he necessarily believes that history is always repetitive, but I think he's presenting it as repetitive here to critique the Aeneid and to critique Rome, right? Because Augustus is saying Rome is the end-all, be-all of everything. And the Aeneid furthers that message to a certain extent. I think it subtly questions it at the same time, but this text is not subtly, it's outright questioning it, and it's questioning it through its presentation of history as repetitive. I think he's saying Rome is not the end-all, be-all. It will fall, as it did, and other empires like the British Empire have fallen since then. And empires are almost always, or they're always, not almost always, they're always temporary. And so I think that's an insight Ovid has here that he gives us through this presentation of cyclical history. And there's a lot of ways to interpret this text. Maybe the futile nature of these unrequited desires is actually a critique of them. And maybe he's very anti-rape, and he's doing it in a more subtle way by never allowing the desire to be requited. I don't know. There's a lot of different ways to take this text, and I think there's a lot of ways you can go with it on the discussion board, so I'm really looking forward to reading those posts. But I certainly think that one central message here is Rome is not permanent, and I think that's a good message for us to have from this text. All right, so discussion board, what can you do there? Definitely compare and contrast the creation narrative from book 1 with either the one from the Hebrew Bible or any of those others from that creation narrative section early on in our textbook. I already highlighted one similarity and one difference when I discussed this earlier in the lecture. I'd love to see you highlight some more, maybe teach me, show me some I haven't picked up on yet. I'd love to learn from you. And then, of course, this topic of rape is difficult but essential to address. And so I already showed kind of the two sides of the spectrum. I want to know from you now, with those two sides of the spectrum outlined, which one do you think the text leans toward more? Is it, it certainly wavers back and forth. It's not, and I think a text can be back and forth. I think the great literary works don't just have one clear stance on the topic. But if you had to pick one, if you had to say this text is subtly critiquing rape or passively condoning it, which would you say? And you can look at the examples I discussed or any of the other examples because, like I said, it comes up a lot. Even in stories where it doesn't actually happen, like Apollo and Daphne, you can infer that that's what would have happened. So had the situation just played out a little differently. So a difficult but important topic that we need to discuss, while the text discusses it. These last two questions I'm going to pop up in a second have more to do with the text as a whole. And so I've addressed a lot of the themes, change, unrequited desire, repetitive history. I've addressed all those, and there are others you should address. And these last two questions are very general. So you can talk about any of those themes or others that you discover on your own for these last two questions. But these last two questions ask you to kind of take a look at the text as a whole, since it is an epic, but it's very different from all the other epics we've read. So what are some of the things it does in the ways that it's different? And you can talk about the more specific themes as part of your examples. So here's the first of these two questions. Ovid composed the Metamorphoses in epic verse. So the lines of poetry. Remember, this is translated in easy-to-read modern English that almost feels like prose, but remember, it was verse, lines of poetry in the original Latin. And so it had the same, all poems have a structure, and so it had the same structure as all the other epics we've read, a certain poetic structure that's called epic verse. So it is, technically speaking, an epic. But unlike the other epics we have read, this poem does not tell the linear narrative of a single hero. So each poem, Gilgamesh about Gilgamesh, the Iliad about Achilles, the Odyssey about Odysseus, the Aeneid about Aeneas, they all tell a story that even some of them, like the Aeneid and the Odyssey, that don't tell events in chronological order, you could still step back and put those events in chronological order. So they're teleological. They have a clear beginning to end, and it's about this character and his story. Sometimes with the Odyssey and the Aeneid, that hero represents his nation, but it's the story of a single hero, a single nation, and their progress, their teleological progress. This is not that way. So what important similarities and differences do you see between the Metamorphoses and the other epics we have read? The differences are clear. I just outlined some. You can go into much more detail. But are there any similarities beyond the verse? Pretty much all scholars agree this is an epic. And there are some other similarities. It's a narrative, right? It tells a story. It's not like the lyric poetry of Catullus or Sappho. So there are other ways it's an epic, but I think it needs more than that to truly be considered an epic. So do you think it's an epic? And are there any similarities or just differences? And what differences do you maybe see that I haven't mentioned yet, or of ones I have mentioned that you could go into more detail? Finally, a similar type of question. In many ways, the Metamorphoses is a collection of short narratives. But do you see any connections between these narratives? Perhaps a central theme that ties them together. Again, I've already discussed central themes that tie the narrative together, but only 3, and I've only said so much. You can go into much more detail. And really what I'm looking at for here, like I said, is the strategy. He wrote this to be different. I think he wanted a kind of a non-epic style for his epic poem, again, to be different, to be contrary to Virgil. I think Ovid was kind of a contrarian. I think he clearly was from what we've read. So why is my question, and how does he use this? It's a really interesting strategy. You've got seemingly disconnected stories that are actually very connected. So tease out, suss out, discern, analyze, find those connections. Explain how he achieves them. How are they important? Essentially, what is the unity of this text? And we should ask that about every text we read, but not as many of them have the seeming disunity of this text, but beneath the surface is actually very unified. So what is that unity? As always, I hope you enjoyed what we've read, and I really look forward to reading your responses for the last time around. So hope you enjoyed this poem. Looking forward to reading your responses.